Good evening. My name is Juan Duque. I'm part of the Spring 2022 Accounting 372 Monday and Wednesday class from 6:30 to 7:45. I'll be talking about Washington State's comprehensive annual financial report for 2020. During part one of the assignment, we were asked to see if the state of Washington was given the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting given by the Government Finance Officers Association. So for the state of Washington, the Certificate of Achievement was awarded. The purpose of the certificate is to encourage states and local governments to prepare comprehensive annual financial reports to show evidence and transparency while fully disclosing the year statements. As you can see in this slide, the award was given to the state of Washington on June 30th, 2019 for the year 2020. Next, we were asked, what are the key issues addressed in the letter of transmittal? The key issues addressed in the letter of transmittal are the state's progressive goals and achievements completed in the previous year. The major topics or headlines discussed are education, health and human services, economy, transportation, environment, and because 2020 was where COVID-19 was starting, especially on that side of the country, the topics above were all shown in the letter of transmittal to show the steps they took in those important needs in the state. They take deep dives into the funding of major projects in these areas and how much government money was allocated towards these different divisions. Most of these issues are pretty self-explanatory. We have education, the amount of money they use for schools and state-funded programs, health and human services, how much the government is helping with medical and Medicaid, transportation, that can be from public transportation to things to infrastructure. Next, which if any independent audit was performed for this CAFR for Washington? The auditor in charge of making this was Pat McCarthy. He is the state auditor of the state of Washington. They did not receive an unqualified audit opinion because they mentioned in the letter that it was presented in a fair way where everything was proven correctly, and that was his final opinion on the CAFR for Washington. The state of Washington has a population of about 7,656,000 people. That was all given in the statistical section of the CAFR, usually at the bottom of them. The types of information that are included in the statistical section other than population include demographic information of the people that live in the state, usually given by the census, the debt capacity, which report the standings of the state's outstanding debt, as well as revenues and financial trends. Finally, it discusses operating information, which helps the reader understand how the reports compare to their activities. Next, we're going to get into part two, which is the preliminary analysis of the state. Here, we're going to start giving numbers that we used on the net position slide tables given on the CAFR. According to the state CFR on June 30, 2020, the total assets is equal to $112 billion. We got these numbers by doing primary government has a totaling of 110, while we added CU, which is equal to 1.70, which gave us a grand total of $112 billion. Then we had total deferred outflow of resources, which gave us a total of 2.3 billion. Then we came up with total liabilities, which is when we added the PG and the CU, which gave us approximately $84 billion. Then we had the total deferred inflow of resources, which came out to about 4.2 billion, which is broken down into primary government and compartment units. Then we have the total net position, which is the difference between assets plus deferred outflows of resources and its liabilities plus deferred inflows of resources. Here I made a little chart for the calculation of net position. We had total assets. We added the deferred outflow of resources. minus the total liability minus the total deferred inflow of resources, which gave us a total net position of 25.628 billion. As you can see on this chart, I just used the numbers that were given. On this slide, we were asked to do unrestricted net position, which is the primary government and the CU. We added those together to get a negative number of 13,761,212. These are all expressed in thousands. And then we had restricted net position of 15,330,000,000. For this restricted net position, I attached a screenshot next to it of a CAFR net position where you can see the highlighted portions. You added all those up, which gave you a grand total of that 15 billion number. The total net position is a positive number in this case. This provides information that the state of Washington has liabilities and deferred inflows of resources lower than their asset and outflow of resources, so they maintain a positive net position. Next, we had to review the statement of activities and figure out the total expenses, the total primary government revenue, the total compartment unit revenue, general revenue, and change in net position. For total expenses, we got 75.10 in thousands, which gave us about billion. Then we had the revenue, which totaled 42 billion. Total compartment, which gave us about 917 million. General revenue was about 60, while the change in net position gave us a grand total of 1.5 billion. Here, next, I attached a graph of a CAFR for 2020, which was what I used to find these numbers with the expenses. We had total primary government totals and total compartment units, and these were the numbers that I added and subtracted to be able to get the numbers that I needed. On the totals, we added them for the calculations. Part 3 now, we had to measure ratios and determine specific highlights that would determine the state's financial sheets. For this one, we first had to calculate the financial position, which was unrestricted net assets divided by the expenses. As you can see here, I got the two numbers, I divided them, which gave me a financial position of negative 20. The next one we were asked to figure out was the financial performance, which was the change in net assets divided by total net assets, which gave me a total of negative 0.06 ratio. Next, we were asked to figure out the liquidity, which was the cash plus current investments plus receivables divided by current liabilities. This one gave me a ratio of 2.88. Lastly, we were asked to solve solvency, which was long-term debts divided by assets, which gave us a 2.87 ratio. The financial position of the state of Washington is showing a negative 0.20 ratio. The ratio indicates that it has a negative net asset resources compared to its expenses. As shown in the above chart, in regards to what it means for the Washington, is that the state has a likelihood of getting into a difficult financial situation if they don't manage budgets better. Next, we were asked about the liquidity of the state. The state of Washington has a liquidity of 2.88. The number is on the positive side because this means it holds enough cash equivalents to be able to sell off to pay its debt if needed. The rule of thumb is that the higher the ratio, usually the better. In this case, Washington has a 2.88, which means they hold enough cash for anything they may come up. The financial performance of Washington was a negative 0.06. This negative number does not mean it can be bad, but rather a ratio of how much change in net assets is affected by the current net assets. Lastly, we were asked to find the solvency of the state, which came out to a 2.87. The solvency is the ability to pay off its long-term debt. Usually the bigger number as a ratio, the better the state is in position to pay these long-term debts. I attached the statement of net positions picture there, where you can see the numbers that I used to find the ratios. We used the liability side, which were more long-term, due within 1 year and due within more than a year, and then we used the total net positions, which was on the bottom. We added those numbers, and then we divided them to get our ratio.